Welcome to the Comfortable in Chaos Podcast. Strangle your demons and let's go.
Y'all need Jesus!
All right, man, let's get after it. People who've listened to me for a while know that I like to serenade, and I like different varieties of music. One group that I have a particular fondness for is Weezer. Four very sharp dudes. So bear with me, and let's go. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. Oh yeah. All right. Feels good. Say it ain't so. Your love is a heartbreaker. Boom, boom. Say it ain't so. President Joe, your love's a life taker. Welcome to the Comfortable in Chaos Podcast. I am your host, Eric Hellberg. We're living a month and a day. You know, we're like Einstein, man. No special talents. Just passionately curious about all things pertaining to men. How in the hell did we get here, and where is it that we want to go? Hopefully as quick as possible to a new election in November and new leadership. Let me spit. All right. Good news there. Spitting the Black Buffalo out. I would love for Black Buffalo to sponsor this show, but they picked up good old Rob O'Neill. That was the guy who wrote the book. The Only Easy Day Was Yesterday, under the pseudonym of Matt Bissonette. He's the operator on the Bin Laden raid that actually put the 2 rounds in Bin Laden's skull. The rest of his teammates did come in and add a few to the torso for good measure. But they have sponsored him, and rightly so. The guy's got street cred all the way from this part of Interstate 10 to where it ends at the airport at LAX in Cali. So, good job, Rob. And you have a great podcast on Spotify, too, called The Operator. Check it out, dudes. All right, so let's talk about old President Joe here. I mentioned him in my song, tied him in to have a little bit of fun. Other than right here in the United States, everyone knows about the border run amok, what's happening there. It's basically open warfare. We've got open warfare in Ukraine, proxy war being fought by us. Really, NATO wants no part of it, but we're driving the whole deal. Now, I'm going somewhere with this. While President Joe has been president, so roughly 3 years, we're wrapping up the 4th, I'm going to tell you a list of the U.S. embassies or consulates around the world that good old Joe has been forced to evacuate and or outright save lives and ultimately close. Typically, they don't get closed preemptively. You know, we have the best intelligence apparatus in the world, but we never know what the hell's going on. So we got to evacuate these embassies and consulates, right? All right. Let's take a look. Everyone's familiar, of course. We had to do that in Kabul, Afghanistan, right? Oh, yeah. The good old Afghani withdrawal. Left all of our equipment, left tons of interpreters, all of their families, even flat out Americans behind. All right, where's another one? Well, February of 22, right? Ukraine. Yep, had to close that one down in Kiev. All right. How about good old Belarus? Had to do that as well. Had to close down the one in Minsk. Okay. You don't hear mention of the fact that we had to close down the embassy in Sudan. Oh, yeah. Those Sudanese are starting to butcher one another again, so I had to close down the good old embassy, evacuate the one in Khartoum. I tell you what, since I mentioned Sudan, obviously, that's a country in the continent of Africa. Did you know we did the same thing earlier this year? on the continent of Africa? Yeah, our good old embassy in Niamey, Niger. Yeah, that's actually above Nigeria. What the hell's going on over there in Africa? We don't hear much about it. It's pure barbaric savagery. And let me go ahead and develop this just a little bit further for you. Just in the past, since one of these started in the 60s, but in the 90s, 4 large-scale civil wars occurred. That wasn't that long ago. And they still spring up all the time, right here in Niger, right here in Sudan. It's ongoing to this day. So what it is really is pure tribalism. It's no different. I mean, just go across the Red Sea like when you're in the Horn of Africa and you're right there in the Middle East, right? They're basically both synonymous. And that's why we don't want to poke our noses in there. I mean, think what happened in 1993 in Somalia, right? All hell had broken loose in 91. Clinton finally decided to intervene. And everyone knows the rest of that story. It's been very well publicized. But move out a year from there, and then you just simply move up the continent a little bit. You're going to move to the north and to the west and get old good Rwanda. You hardly ever hear about it. It still was occurring during Clinton's presidency. And what happened? 2 million people, roughly 20% of the Rwandan population at that time, were butchered with machetes, every variation of knife, ice pick, pickaxe, axes, for the more civilized types, chainsaws. And everyone talks about racism. Let's talk about what happened in Rwanda. And that's not an isolated incident. It's been happening for hundreds of years on that continent. Hundreds of years. But let's use the example of Rwanda. You basically had the Hutus, that tribe, that sect, that had demonized, marginalized. You know, I just did an episode on our own politics right here in Texas. What happens when you demonize and or marginalize a group of people? And we've got some very right-wing Christian zealots trying to do exactly that to our own population if they have a D by their name, meaning a Democrat. We can disagree with people. We don't have to abide by what people want. But we can't treat people like animals. We can't treat people like less than. But they do in Africa. So the good old Hutus decide to eradicate the Tutsis. And over a 100-day period of time, 3 months, the wholesale slaughter of 2 million people. Now, here's what's so crazy about it. You hear about racism and people looking different and people of color. Well, the Hutu government had done its very best to issue ID cards, which would identify the Tutsis. But did you know what would happen in schools across Rwanda? Teachers would have unknowing students at the beginning of the massacre raise their hand if they were Tutsi. Because those teachers that looked like the students looked like the teachers, could not tell at first glance. So they needed a readily available identification system. Once those students raised their hand and identified as being Tutsis, they were slaughtered by the neighborhood militias that were allied with the Hutus. How about that for you? In fact, it got so bad that Hutu husbands were macheting to death their Tutsi wives. That's friggin' nuts, right? And you have a civil war going on right now in Sudan and total unrest in Niger right now. And that, my friends, is why, let's go back 2 more steps. We hear the word slavery. Slavery is a derivative of the Slavic word. You hear that? Slavic word, slavery, because white European Slavs were enslaved hundreds of years before the wholesale incorporation of the African slave trade that we get pushed down our throat day in and day out here in America. No one here in America has any idea what real enslavement is, at least in present day. In fact, if you go through all of recorded history, who did God make covenant with? His chosen people, the Jews, right? They were taken slaves. We are all descended from slaves in one form or fashion. And just like when Morgan Freeman was sitting with Don Lemon and Don Lemon's trying to espouse all of his junk, although he has a white homosexual husband or boyfriend, Megyn Kelly's reported on him before, slapping white guys' asses in the club with the bub and the dub and the this and that, decrying how he's been oppressed and he's pulling out $8 bills a year at CNN. And Morgan Freeman's making that for each picture. He's like, Don, you're a fool. Stop talking about it. You and I wouldn't be here. We're indicative of the fact that that has no bearing on our life. We can always reflect on history, but shouldn't we move forward? So when you look at the barbarity of the continent of Africa, that's why these slave traders that we are familiar with could only outline their shores. They could not take their armies into the interior of the continent of Africa, or they would receive a wholesale slaughtering. We're talking about Rwanda, right? In the mid-90s, they're butchering people with machetes. And you think that a shipload of ships at that time, 2 shiploads, 3 shiploads of soldiers are going to walk into the interior of any part of Africa and not have their asses handed to them? No, sir. Not only no, sir, hell no. It is an impossibility. Personnel were taken from within the interior of Africa from their own corresponding tribes and or opposing tribes, then brought to the docks and sold by their own people or people who looked very much like their own people. In fact, that movie that had, it came out last year, I believe, and it was about the warrior queen or something like that. That tribe, whereby the king relied on all these great women fighters, was one of the most prolific ones involved in the slave trade. Dispense with the nonsense that people are pushing down our throat. That ends the argument right there. Let's move forward, because Africa is still in holy unrest. So we had to shut down that embassy too, right? In Sudan. All right. Well, what else do we have going on? We just shut down another embassy. Good old Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Haiti's gone to the dogs now. All under Joe's watchful eye. But I guess what I'm getting at here is, especially with regards to now in Haiti, that's immediate, the one in Niger, the one in Sudan. We learned a little lesson in Somalia. It was a very small fraction of what can possibly occur. But the very next year, when it kicked off in Rwanda, and or the civil war that still spikes and goes up and down in the Congo. And that is a war that lasted over 10 years, and you had about 500,000 people butchered. But on the extremes of that, from starvation and malnutrition, which was a derivative of that war, approximately 5 million people. When you look at Ethiopia fighting Eritrea right next to one another, a few other 100,000, all this has occurred in the late 90s and into, in the case of the Congo War, the Second Congo War, 2008. Why aren't we involved? Why are we not involved? People are dying. Human beings are dying in the most horrific ways. We're concerned about Ukraine. We're not concerned about Mexico or our southern border. Are we only concerned about the people and countries whereby we have something to gain and or profit, something to exploit? The hell with Africa, right? Yeah, can't get anything from that. But Ukraine's vitally important. Boy, I tell you. Okay, just a little food for thought. So old Joe is running amok and the world is running amok while he is in there. So have we had enough yet? Let's demonstrate a few more acts of malfeasance under the reign, or we could call that a reign of terror, right, of old Joe. I just got a report via email from a couple of my Quora buddies that masses and masses, hundreds of Bradley fighting vehicles and M1A1 Abrams tanks have landed in Greece. Now, I mean, you could kind of take a circuitous route and go through Bulgaria, Romania, and work your way up to Ukraine. But, I mean, we're a logistically solid nation. We know how to move equipment around. Couldn't we get it closer if that is, in fact, where it's destined for, as opposed to a port in Greece? Maybe not. But maybe that's not what it is only for. It will be interesting to see what happens here in the next couple of weeks. And then we now know, and of course, our intelligence services must be involved, and undoubtedly, my guess is the Mossad in Israel blew the top off this, but I know that we work very closely with them and vice versa. It looks like old Joe and or Barack, who's behind him, they want Netanyahu out now in Israel. Oh yeah, Israel's involved in a war in Gaza right now with those Hamas scallywags. And we know that basically what is occurring is that Joe doesn't know what to do. He doesn't want to outwardly offend the supporters of Israel, and Israel should be supported. And they have total predestination to do exactly what the hell they want to do to eradicate these scum. But Joe doesn't like it. The Democratic Party's pushing back. What about the Palestinians? What's going on here? Well, what about the 1,500 Israelis that were slaughtered on that day? Israel's a small country. When you aggregate those numbers and you look at them on a per capita rate, imagine going back to 9/11, instead of 3,000 killed, that would have been equivalent to about 46 to 50,000 people killed in New York on that day when you get into comparative populations. Oh, yeah. Well, basically what's happening is since Joe cannot do anything overtly, he's trying now to do something covertly and get Netanyahu out of there. I guess time will tell what happens. And then finally, just to cement the fact, and I don't think Joe's going to stick around much longer. I think he'll make his exit, like I mentioned in my last episode, at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention. But finally, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. We have military establishments that are designed to protect us. And one of our vaunted service academies, better known as the United States Military Academy, that is West Point, under good old Joe's tutelage, now wants to remove duty, honor, and country from its mission statement. So what else is there? I guess pretty soon they're going to take the swords from the cadets and say that it is some type of a phallic symbol and it's offending all the lesbians there. I don't know. I mean, because obviously we need to commission lesbian officers so they can go into the combat arms field and lead men just without their swords. Can it get any zanier, guys? I don't think so. So until next time on the Comfortable in Chaos podcast, I bid you bon voyage, my burgeoning flock.